Humans have been gazing at the sky for millennia, and for nearly just as long, we've been seeing mysterious and unexplainable objects whizzing by or hovering above us. UFO sightings have been reported throughout recorded history and in various parts of the world. Traces of their visits may lie in artifacts like the Nazca Lines, ancient Greek and Roman texts, cave art, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Newspaper articles dating back to the 1800s report seeing airships, flying machines, and strange visitors. Somewhere along the line, they began making physical contact. What's really going on? Are innocent people actually being abducted by aliens? Is there another explanation? I'm Brooke, and today we'll be diving into the UFO abduction phenomenon. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Armchair Investigator. Abductee, a person who has been taken away by force or deception. Syndrome, a group of signs and symptoms that occur together and characterize a particular abnormality or condition. Have you ever wondered about the nature of UFO abductions? Who are the people claiming to have been abducted, and why them? One of the earliest reports of UFO abductions came out of Brazil in October of 1957. Then, nothing on record until the infamous Betty and Barney Hill case out of New Hampshire in 1966. The next big story came in 1973, when two men claimed they were abducted while fishing in Mississippi. By 1975, more and more cases were coming to light, with an alarming number of people beginning to suspect they may have been abducted by aliens. A survey published in 1992 found that perhaps as many as 1 out of every 50 adults in the United States had had an alien encounter. In the early 90s, Harvard Psychiatrist Dr. Mack began studying the UFO abduction phenomenon. He spent years working with people claiming to have been abducted. In 1994, he published a book detailing his findings. Now, back in 1989, when John first heard reports of people claiming to have been abducted by humanoid beings, he believed there were two logical reasons. They were either suffering from delusions, or they were mistaken in what they had experienced. After all, the notion of people being abducted by non-human entities simply wasn't possible, at least according to John. Then John began meeting with these so-called abductees, and what they had to say knocked him off his feet. These were people who were mentally competent, sane, rational, and they were so shaken up by what they had encountered that they almost doubted their experiences altogether. In fact, most were hesitant to even talk about what happened to them. Coming forward with their experiences, there was little to gain and a lot to lose. John said he had 3 options. He could ignore what he was learning, find ways to explain it all away, or expand his worldview. He chose the latter. And while the idea of alien abductions didn't fall into John's beliefs or notions of reality, he decided he was going to keep an open mind, choosing to believe that the experiences he was hearing about were in some way real. In January of 1990, John was first introduced to the abduction phenomenon by a man named Bud Hopkins, a New York artist who had been working with abductees for more than a decade at that point. What initially caught John's attention were the similarities between the abductees' stories, even though they weren't in communication with each other. Everything from how they got to and from the spaceships to how they described the inside of the ships to the procedures the aliens carried out were similar. The experiences they reported had all of the characteristics of a real event. They gave highly detailed accounts of what happened, down to the most minute detail. And they were clearly deeply affected, both on an emotional and physical level. John said while it might appear to the uninformed like mass hysteria, this was different. The cases he heard about didn't act like a collective disorder. They were much too personal.
We're perfectly normal people. We're probably your coworkers, your family, or your friends, and we're having quite extraordinary experiences. And we're all trying to understand what's happening to us, who's doing it, and why.
I had gone down to bed that night when 4 of these beings came into my house, and I was still awake, laying down in my bed. I don't know where they came from or how, but they came in very fast into the room, heading toward me. I turned to face them. I mean, I really, literally thought I was going to die. The beings measured 3 feet 11. They appeared very cold. It's really, really disturbing to be in a room with something that isn't supposed to exist. I was taken on the craft. I was brought to some very contained room. I can't talk about what was done there because it's too personal. It's just unbelievable.
If these abductions were really happening, John wondered how often. What was the source of these encounters? Who was helping these people process what they were experiencing? And what were mental health professionals saying? John was of the belief that mental health professionals had a responsibility to help individuals who report UFO abduction experiences, and that their claims deserved to be treated with scientific objectivity rather than automatic rejection. While it's easy for mental health professionals to assume that patients are either psychotic or masking trauma stemming from other things, and that can be the case sometimes, for a majority of patients claiming to have been abducted, they were neither psychotic nor masking prior abuse. They did, however, suffer from anxiety and hypervigilance. If John was going to work with these people, he wanted to go about it in a respectful yet methodical way, choosing to suspend the use of language like real, unreal, exists, does not exist, happened, did not happen. His main goal was to simply collect raw information and later try to analyze it. John believed that there were 5 elements to account for when it came to those claiming to have had an alien encounter. The first was a high degree of consistency and detailed account of what happened. The patient displays appropriate emotions that would go along with an actual experience. The second marker is the absence of any psychiatric illness or conditions that could account for what's being reported. The third indicator could be some type of physical change or lesion on the body, with no obvious or clear explanation. The fourth element would be an independent witness that could back up what the abductee was claiming. And the fifth marker would be accounts of abductions from children too young for delusional psychiatric syndromes or to be affected by cultural influences. Those coming to John claiming to be abductees were given an initial 1.5 to 2 hour screening. John collected information about them, their family, their life history, and any possible abduction-related encounters. While some of his patients required hypnosis in order to fully access their abduction experiences, some of them had conscious recall of the events that took place. For example, one patient, who was 19 years old, could remember being abducted when he was 4. He could vividly recall being picked up during the middle of the day in a clearing behind the apartment complex he and his family lived in. He remembered the gray aliens and being taken into a spaceship. He could describe the saucer-like UFO and the beings inside it. And he even remembered being forced to lie down while a sample of his skin was taken with some sort of cylindrical-looking instrument. 3.5 years in, John had seen more than 100 people who were referred to him for abduction evaluations. Of those 100, 76 met John's criteria for an abduction case, 47 women and 29 men. The individuals John worked with came from all walks of life. We're talking students, homemakers, businessmen, prison guards, psychologists, computer engineers. Psychological testing revealed no evidence of mental health conditions or emotional disturbances that could explain for their abductions. In essence, they were your typical cross-section of society. They were quote-unquote normal. If the abductees couldn't be grouped together based on their backgrounds, was it possible that certain personality types could be associated with abductions? An encounter-prone personality, if you will. Well, it's hard to tell. See, John found that a number of individuals he was working with began having encounters as young children, some even in early infancy. John noted that many of the abductees came from broken homes or had one or more alcoholic parents. Still, many of the people he worked with came from well-functioning, intact families. John also noticed that a number of his cases involved a lack of emotional connection within their families, which is interesting because some abductees claim they were told by a female alien that she was their true mother. And the individuals who were told this couldn't help but feel that deep down it was true. that their human mother and father weren't their true parents. Some of the individuals John worked with even believed that they turned out better than their other siblings because of the support they had received from aliens. Overall, John got the impression that abductees, as a whole, were usually open-minded and intuitive individuals. They were more flexible in their thinking, accepting of diversity, and less tolerant than usual of government control. John's work also seemed to point to the idea that aliens were interested in studying the human condition, specifically trauma and suffering. Several abductees reported that aliens had intervened on their behalf in a protective and healing manner after incidents of abuse. While helping his patients work through their abduction experiences, John said that while their stories started off traumatic, in the end they often felt deeply connected with the alien beings. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the abduction phenomenon was the remembering. Detailed and vivid experiences could be triggered years or even decades after they had occurred. It could be the most minute thing that prompted a memory. Not only did John work with abductees one-on-one, but he also began holding support group meetings so that his patients didn't feel isolated. These meetings provided a safe space for his patients to talk about an often scary and confusing aspect of their lives, without fear of ridicule and rejection. Throughout the course of his work, John found that many abductees began having encounters in early childhood, and, like I said earlier, sometimes even infancy. Indicators of childhood abductions include having memories of small beings in their bedrooms, intense bright lights, and a humming sensation at the onset of the encounter. They remember being floated down the hallway and out of the house, seeing a UFO up close, and having visions of being in a strange room where invasive treatments were performed on them. Some recalled how, as children, tiny objects were inserted into their noses, occasionally resulting in nosebleeds. Sometimes these beings were seen as friendly playmates or healers. In fact, a number of the abductees John worked with said they felt like the aliens were their protectors in early childhood, but their encounters became more serious and distressing as they approached puberty. John's work also uncovered the concept of interfamilial abductions, meaning multiple members of the same family experiencing abductions from alien-like beings. He even found instances of multi-generational encounters. And while a person may experience recurring abductions throughout their life, John was never able to find a pattern for when or why these additional encounters would happen. Other things his abductees had in common were a fear of hospitals, insects, elevators, sexual contact, feeling vulnerable at night, insomnia, needing to cover the windows, sleeping with a light on as an adult, and having unsettling dreams. They also experienced unexplained lesions, cuts, odd rashes, sinus pain, and gastrointestinal and urinary problems. He would eventually describe what was happening to his patients as abduction syndrome. John classified his work into 3 categories. The first category dealt with the literal and physical level. This would be a visual sighting of a UFO or something like an implant being found in an abductee's body following an experience. The second category dealt with things that seemed like they could be understood by us if we had the knowledge behind it. Think extraterrestrial phenomenon that appears to be more advanced than us. Things like propulsion systems, the ability to disappear from radar, and being able to rapidly change speed and direction. The third category dealt with experiences reported by abductees that we simply can't explain. This includes reports from abductees who sense that their experiences with aliens were not occurring in our space-time universe, the feeling that abductees were returning home, and the concept of aliens being shapeshifters, often appearing to abductees as owls, eagles, raccoons, and deer. Through his patient stories, John discovered that there seemed to be stages to an abduction. He found that most encounters and abductions occurred during the night or early morning hours, and often began in the home or while a person is driving. In some cases, they occurred in nature. Oftentimes, the first indicators that an abduction is about to happen is that an intense white or blue light floods the person's bedroom or surroundings. This is often accompanied by an odd humming or buzzing sound. Many then report sensing or seeing an unknown presence before ultimately being taken to a strange spacecraft. Many abductees have also reported that electronic devices like TVs, radios, clocks, and lights go haywire just prior to an abduction occurring. if a majority of John's abduction cases took place at night, was it possible they were dreaming? While it's certainly plausible, John said that during these encounters, his patients either hadn't fallen asleep yet, or they had been woken up by something just prior to the encounter happening. After that initial contact, abductees reported being floated away. Depending on where they were at the time of the encounter, this could be down the hall, through a window, or even through the roof of a car. Something that was shocking, as they were able to pass through solid objects, feeling nothing more than a slight vibration. It seemed that in most cases, the beam of light served as an energy source for transporting the abductees from point A to point B. During the transportation process, the abductee was typically escorted to the spacecraft by anywhere from 1 to 3 humanoid beings. If all this wasn't terrifying enough, early on in the encounter, abductees were paralyzed by either the touch of the being's hand or some type of handheld instrument. The UFOs varied in size from just a few feet across to several hundred yards wide. They were described as silver metallic and usually cigar, saucer, or dome-shaped, with red, orange, white, or blue lights that came from the bottom of the craft. From there, some abductees were taken to a larger mothership, while others reported being floated up through the sky directly to the larger ship itself. Once inside the craft, abductees said they were taken to a room where various procedures were done to them. Many have said the rooms were brightly lit, humid, and cool, with strange-looking equipment lining the walls. They described it as almost hospital-like. John learned about several different alien beings throughout the course of his work. Some were described as tall, some short, some seemed to be glowing, while others were translucent. Some of his patients saw Nordic-looking blonde human-like beings. But perhaps most common of all were the small grays, hairless humanoid beings that stood 3 to 4 feet tall, had large pear-shaped heads, huge black eyes with no eyelashes or lids, long arms with 3 to 4 fingers and opposable thumbs, a thin torso, and skinny legs. They had no ears, 2 simple nostril holes, and a thin, lipless mouth with no teeth. Their faces bore no pores or signs of aging, and their bodies were devoid of muscular development, as well as any signs of male or female distinction. It was said they typically wore boots, a tunic-like smock, and sometimes a hood or cowl. In 1987, folklorist Thomas Bullard conducted a comprehensive analysis of abduction narratives and found that an estimated 73% of all close encounters mentioned gray alien beings. In fact, the description of the small grays has remained remarkably consistent for decades. Of all the odd features of the grays, their large eyes seem to be the most terrifying, with some abductees describing them as a sort of goggle or protective lens. But that wasn't even the most unsettling part of all. A number of abductees said that the grays used their eyes to compel them to do things they didn't want to do, and that looking into them caused a sense of overwhelming dread and loss of free will. John said a number of his patients described the lights as good and caring, while the grays were indifferent and almost businesslike. Abductees often described a slightly taller leader or doctor, along with what they felt were female nurses. And to John, it seemed that most communication that occurred between alien and human was done telepathically. So what kind of procedures were the aliens performing? Well, John broke them down into 2 categories: physical and informational. Once an abductee was undressed, they were placed on a table and extensively examined. Alien instruments could penetrate virtually every part of an abductee's body: the sinuses, eyes, ears, genitalia, abdomen, skull, limbs, and chest. Skin, hair, and other samples from inside the body are typically taken. However, the most common and arguably most important procedures, according to abductees, involve the human reproductive system, with procedures being done that harvested sperm samples from the men and the removal or fertilization of eggs in a female. And yes, some abductees reported being impregnated by the aliens and later having either an alien-human or human-human pregnancy removed. Some even remember small fetuses being put into containers and incubators. A few abductees have reported seeing hybrid children, adolescents, and adults. They were even told by the aliens that the hybrids were their own. Sometimes the aliens encouraged mothers to hold and nurture the hybrid beings. Dr. Mack said that these types of encounters were initially deeply disturbing to abductees, but that their fears were calmed once they realized they weren't in danger of being harmed. Some abductees even reported having their fears and anxieties alleviated through instruments that altered the energy in their body. And listen to this. Reproductive focus elements appear in nearly 70% of detailed abduction accounts. John found that other important aspects of abduction had to do with information and altering the consciousness of the abductees on a deep emotional and spiritual level. Not only that, they were given information about the fate of the Earth and the human responsibility for the destructive activities taking place. Sometimes this information starts being conveyed to abductees when they're children. They report seeing images of Earth devastated by nuclear destruction, pollution, massive earthquakes, fires, and floods. Some abductees were given assignments and told to help other survivors should these catastrophes happen. Some abduction researchers have argued that this information isn't shared with abductees in hopes of making positive changes, but rather to study the abductees' reactions and deceive them into thinking they want to help. Many of the abductees John spoke with were convinced that some sort of homing or tracking devices had been inserted into their bodies so that aliens could track and monitor them. In fact, one of his patients gave him a small, wiry object that was roughly a half an inch to a quarter of an inch thin, claiming it had come out of her nose after what she believed was an abduction experience. While these encounters are initially terrifying for abductees, they would ultimately end up being incredibly transformative. John found his patients experienced everything from an ego death to an almost religious awakening. Some found their worldview had expanded and viewed time and space differently. John's patients walked away with an altered sense of their place in the world. They felt more love, respect, and harmony with Earth and nature. In 1989, a man named Ed began remembering something that happened to him in the summer of 1961 when he was in high school. Over the next few months, he began having flashbacks. Not knowing how to process what he was experiencing, he got in touch with Dr. John Mack in July of 1992. The following account is Ed's story of what happened to him in July of 1961. He had been on a summer camping trip with his friend's family. They had been staying just north of Portland, Maine, and were only a couple hundred yards from the sea. The parents stayed in the cabin while the boys slept in the car with the seats folded down. One night, Ed fell asleep, only to be woken suddenly. He was no longer in his friend's car. Ed described being in a pod that had a glass bubble over it. He could still see the water and waves crashing below. Ed said he was in a small room with transparent curved walls. The room felt warm and safe. He could hear light classical music and guessed it was from one of the houses below. When he looked down at himself, he was naked. That's when a female alien entered the room. And while Ed couldn't recall any other abduction experiences prior to this, the being felt familiar. The two had a sexual encounter and then began what he called a lesson, almost like she was a teacher. Ed said he wanted to write things down, but the being wouldn't let him, assuring him that he would remember when he needed to. Ed said the things he learned left him feeling dumbfounded and opened his consciousness. The being went on to relay that humans weren't conducting themselves properly in terms of how we were handling international politics, the environment, violence towards each other, and food. She warned that we would inevitably be dealing with the fallout of not acting in harmony with the laws of the universe. And while this information was largely new to Ed, he said it somehow made sense to him. As Ed learned of the heavily destructive path we humans were taking, he walked away a changed person. It was as if the world's trauma had embedded itself deep into his being. He made the analogy of changing out software and hardware in a computer. The outside remained the same, but the computer system ran differently. Ed said the being seemed to be able to read his thoughts, and she confirmed that he had had encounters with aliens before. Fast forward a few years, after graduating from high school, Ed went to engineering school and then transferred to a small liberal arts college to study human civilization. In his 20s and 30s, he became somewhat of a loner. In the late 1970s, he married a woman named Lynn. The couple struggled with fertility problems, which Ed believed could be abduction-related. The couple reported that Lynn experienced 3 or 4 spontaneous pregnancy terminations, as well as chunks of missing time, leading Lynn to suspect that she had also had alien encounters. As Dr. Mack and Ed used hypnosis to work through the events of that encounter he had while in high school, Ed was able to recall that night in further detail. Here's what he had to say. He described getting ready to drift off to sleep when he felt a tingling sensation at the base of his head. He said it frightened him. As the tingling increased, he said he could sense something just outside the car. That's when he saw 2 figures looking through the car window. They didn't look human. Ed said they had big black, gray, or black eyes and intense, small mouths. Some sort of ear-like thing. And this fog, I can't quite make out what you guys look like. You guys are clever. You know how to use camouflage. As the tingling sensation persisted, Ed felt himself drift out of the car. He began to drift out along the shoreline, confused as to how he was moving above the water with no visible means of propulsion. Ed knew how bizarre this all sounded, telling Dr. Mack, "It doesn't fit what's supposed to happen. This is what you submit in a script to the Twilight Zone." Ed said as he drifted down the shoreline, he came upon a luminescent dome-like pod. Inside the craft was a bluish-silver glowing light. He believed he was in some sort of operating room, with at least half a dozen beings there watching. A female being approached him. Ed said she could 100% read his mind. She even spoke his name to him telepathically. She told Ed he wasn't in any harm or danger, and that they needed his sperm to create special babies for the work they were doing to help the people on Earth. Ed believed her. He said there was something trusting, loving, and caring about her, like she truly wanted to help. The next thing Ed remembered was that he was in a different area. It was the pod he described earlier with the translucent walls. That's when the alien began talking to him about the future of the Earth. Telepathically, she began showing him apocalyptic images. The message was clear. Our planet was becoming unstable. Humans were losing their connection with nature. They needed to learn how to work with the planet and not plunder all the natural resources. If we could do that, Earth would eventually rebalance itself. And while Ed had always felt close to Mother Nature, he believed that the alien being had opened up his connection and channeled to it even more. Ed wasn't able to recall his encounter he had as a teenager for nearly 30 years, and yet the things he learned seemed to be working quietly in the back of his mind. He was more intuitive and connected with nature than his peers. But Dr. Mack wondered, did Ed's open-minded personality predispose him to being chosen for an encounter? Dr. Mack also noted that a common experience for male abductees was the forced taking of their sperm for the purpose of interspecies breeding. Another common experience for both male and female abductees was learning about environmental disasters and being shown frightening apocalyptic images. It's interesting to note that Ed's encounter as a teenager occurred just 2 months prior to the abduction case of Betty and Barney Hill in Newby, New Hampshire. John was blown away by the patterns he found in each of his patients' cases. He concluded that the experiences reported by abductees could be divided into 3 categories: physical, informative, and spiritual. Dr. Mack realized that while encounters are difficult to prove through the methods of empirical science, the sheer number and consistency in the physical findings made them too important to dismiss. He believed the greatest mass of data came from the reports of experiencers themselves. Although each person's experience is their own and unique, there were consistencies that defied conventional psychiatric explanations. In no case so far have I found a way of tying the troubling events of my clients' history to their abduction stories. Rather, any disturbance seemed to be caused by their encounter, not the other way around. So many cases involved a shift in the environment, most often signaled by a humming sound or vibration. Experiencers described moving into another reality. One described it as if the aliens had broken through a screen. Then there's the appearance of a bright light with seemingly no logical explanation, followed by a sense or sighting of a presence. The experiencer is then taken by force, often through a beam of light or some type of energy device. The craft they are taken to is most often described as saucer-like or cigar-shaped and metallic. The inside is frequently described as cool, musty, and filled with computer-like devices. Once inside the craft, abductees report seeing a number of alien beings who seem to be engaged in business-like activity or preparing for various procedures. The procedures that are done to them seem to have a medical or surgical-like quality to them, and for the most part, the instruments they use are unfamiliar. The procedures typically involve taking information from the abductee's brain, monitoring their state, and inserting or removing implants and tissue samples. John noted that the experiences his patients recalled, both consciously and under hypnosis, were full of powerful and intense emotions, as if they were living it, not just telling a story. Ed, for example, seemed to be talking to the aliens during his session with Dr. Mack. Instead of saying, "They were clever, they knew how to use camouflage," he said, "You guys are clever, you know how to use camouflage." Abductee accounts were incredibly vividly detailed, almost overwhelming. His patients cried, thrashed, perspired, and screamed while talking about their encounters. While it's impossible to know the true prevalence of abduction due to a lack of physical evidence and a reluctance of experiencers to come forward, John certainly wasn't the only one studying the abduction phenomenon. Abduction researchers pooled their information, estimating that there were well over 200,000 abduction cases nationwide, and that was in the early 90s. The pioneering work of Dr. David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, and folklorist Thomas Bullard also corroborated John's work. See, Dr. David Jacobs had been studying UFO and abduction phenomenon since the early 70s, working with more than 150 abductees. Of his patients, he said, "Often they would describe abduction events that I had heard perhaps hundreds of times, and then look at me and ask, 'Has anybody ever said anything like that to you before?'" Then there's Bud Hopkins. By the mid-70s, he too was heavily involved in abduction cases. His work highlighted the notion of certain humans being monitored by aliens over a period of time, the idea that aliens could shapeshift into different animals, people being abducted multiple times, starting as young children, and abductees reporting chunks of missing time. In 1989, Thomas Bullard conducted a large-scale comparative analysis of all known abduction stories. He found that the procedures and protocols described by abductees were eerily similar. These abduction reports identified a common sequence of events that lined up with what John was hearing from his patients: capture, examination, conference, tour, journey, return. He said, "Abduction stories remain more consistent than we would expect, given how readily narrators improvise on folklore narratives such as urban legends, varying them with exuberance even when media sources stress only a single source." Basically, what he's saying is that stories tend to become exaggerated as they're told. Little details are changed to make them larger than life. But with alien abduction stories, that's not really the case. The 1992 Roper survey findings were illuminating, showing that UFO abductions were surprisingly prevalent in the American population. The survey established that 1 in 5 adults have woken up paralyzed, with the sense of a strange figure or presence in the room. 1 in 8 adults have experienced a period of an hour or more in which they apparently lost, but couldn't remember why. 1 in 10 adults have felt the experience of actually flying through the air without knowing how or why. 1 in 12 adults have seen unusual lights or balls of lights in a room without understanding what was causing them. And 1 in 12 adults have discovered puzzling scars on their body without remembering how or why they were acquired. As with anything, abduction cases have sparked controversy. Should these stories be taken at face value? How reliable are memories? Not to mention the controversial methods of recovering them, like hypnosis, for example. Some argue that abductions aren't real and point to things like past abuse, sleep disorders, false memories, sleep paralysis, and epilepsy to explain away abduction stories. In 1977, Alvin Lawson, an English professor at Cal State Long Beach, and 2 of his colleagues began working with a clinical hypnotist. Together, they studied 10 women and 6 men, aged from 12 to 65, who had no significant knowledge of UFOs, but were asked under hypnosis to imagine details of an abduction encounter. The results were later compared with accounts by actual abduction experiencers. To their surprise, striking similarities emerged. Believing their subjects came up with details that were too complex to have come from pop culture sources. Lawson, who distrusted hypnosis, couldn't account for the results, which seemed to suggest that abduction experiences could be fabricated. He theorized that both real and imagined abduction stories might spring from some common sensory stimulus that remained a mystery. Later, he hypothesized that they grew out of remembered birth experiences. John argued that Lawson's findings didn't really explain the abduction phenomenon, especially the scars and multiple witness accounts. And even Lawson agreed that UFO abductions seemed distinct from any other hallucinatory experiences. While John's academic reputation undeniably suffered over the years, he stayed committed to his work, convinced his patients were telling the truth, dismissing concerns about his methods, saying that people should keep an open mind. His worry lay with his patients, saying that abductees suffered a fourfold trauma: the experience itself, the isolation of knowing no one believed them, the shattered sense of reality, and the terror of knowing it could happen again at any time. They were, in every sense of the word, powerless to protect themselves and their family. If it's not mental illness, mass hysteria, false memories, or a medical condition, could it be a near-death experience? How about demonic possession? One thing is certain: something bizarre and altogether terrifying has been happening to people all over the world. It begs the question: what happens when anomalous claims, like abductions, are ignored by science and later turn out to be true? The research done by Mack, Hopkins, Bullard, and Jacobs, however outlandish some deem it to be, has helped preserve invaluable information that could be of use in the future. Now, I pass the question off to you. Do you believe those claiming to have been abducted? Perhaps you yourself have had an experience. Let us know in the comments below. If you appreciate today's video, give it a thumbs up. And hey, while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on the next investigation. And remember, strange things don't happen to people because they believe in strange things. They believe in strange things because strange things happen to them.